Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today's webinar. This is the second session of the webinar series organized by the Women in Operations Research and Management Science Forum of Informs, or WORMS as we call ourselves. My name is Magda Kachatyan and I'm a current president of WORMS. This year, WORMS celebrates its 25th anniversary. Since the first day, this forum was organized to educate people about issues and opportunities impacting parity in a society, especially in relevant organizations to our ORMS. Please consider becoming WORMS member and be active and engaged. You are very valuable to our cause. We are active in LinkedIn and other social platforms for everyone to follow and participate in discussions. Here are the links. Please, we'll share these links later on as well. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will be able to share a link with you after the event is complete. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it with the colleagues. We also invite your comments and questions. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. Our moderators will hold them for a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And now let's go back to our webinar. Today's presentation is on the role of agility and analytics in powering supply chain through disruptions, presented by Anne Robinson and Polly Mitchell-Gurtin. As you all know, Anne Robinson was a former president of Informs. She is now Chief Strategy Officer at Kinexus, responsible for accelerating Kinexus strategy development to add further value to customers. Anne has extensive experience in managing supply chain for complex global organizations. Previously, Anne was Executive Director of Global Supply Chain Strategy, Analytics and Systems at Verizon, and also spent several years at Cisco, where she was responsible for managing advanced analytics, BI, and performance management teams. Polly is a VP of Industry Outreach and Thought Leadership at Kinexus. Previously, she was Director of Analytics Consulting Services at the University of North Carolina Healthcare Systems and worked in various roles at SAS, in Advanced Analytics R&D as Director of SAS Global Academic Program. Polly has been very active at Informs and co-founded the third chapter of Women in Machine Learning and Data Science. Thank you very much for joining here, Anne and Polly. And now, without further ado, I'll turn the time over to you, Anne and Polly. Here you go.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having us today. You know, we believe firmly in the objective of WORMS, and we're really glad to be here. Before we start, though, I did just want to say out loud that Polly are discussing, we both wanted to address that COVID-19 has been first and foremost a human crisis, and that we understand that many people, even those on the call right now, may be going through some very difficult times. So we wanted to extend a special thank you for taking an hour out of your life to spend it with us as we have a chance to share some thoughts that we have today. So thank you for that. The talk today is really going to be around the application of agility and analytics in navigating through this disruptive time for supply chains. But we wanted to start it off a little bit. You heard about Polly and I. We realized that collectively we've had more than 30 years of service to Informs, and both are big believers that it's a professional society is where you can find your mentor, find your friend network, guide your career, and ultimately be in a place of opportunity to share your thoughts back with the community. For those of you who aren't familiar with Kinexus, Kinexus is a supply chain planning and risk management software company, been around since the mid-'80s, started as a purpose-built hardware solution for MRP. In mid-'90s, shifted over to software, and by the early 2000s, we're one of the first software companies to shift to in the cloud. You can see that we have many users across many countries and have a very extensive partner network. And when it comes to supply chain planning, and you'll hear a little bit about this today, we believe in a philosophy called concurrent planning, which really empowers our software, but also we believe is one of the keys to navigating a lot of the disruptions that supply chains are facing today. We focus on 6 primary industries. You'll see some company names here that are familiar to you across aero and defense, automotive, consumer products, high tech, industrial, and life sciences. And while I won't drain this slide, I love this particular slide because it speaks to the breadth and depth of supply chain problems that our customers face and what they reach out to us to have a conversation about. So we'll make these slides available. You can certainly, particularly for the students on the call, you may find this interesting as you're researching problems or trying to figure out your next steps. I wanted to talk a little bit about the new normal and what supply chains are facing these days. We do invite questions. We'll wait till the end to actually get them. I see there's a couple of notes there in the chat panel for everybody, but certainly write your questions as we go along and we will approach those at the end. Disruption isn't something new to supply chain. For many years, you can go back for the last 2 decades and identify major activities that happened globally, whether they were geopolitical, whether they were natural disasters, that impacted the supply chain in different ways. And in fact, if you look at an article posted by Angel Mendez on LinkedIn at the middle of April timeframe, he speaks about how all CEOs are now supply chain risk managers. And so it talks about many of these disruptive events that have happened over the years. But it's been well stated that there has been no disruption to supply chain that has had such an enormous and global impact as COVID-19. And that's really what's landed us in the situation we are today. You can't turn on the TV without hearing about supply chain shortages, supply chain opportunities, supply chain disruptions and how they're impacting our lives. Whether it's thinking about things like lead time, and we've all experienced this. We were so used to the Amazon effect where you could have what you wanted on your door the next day. And now we're waiting 2 and 3 weeks for products that we might have expected, almost taken for granted the availability. On the flip side, things have skyrocketed in demand, like webcams, cleaning products, and then on the other end of things, beauty products, a lot of things that might be specialized. I think even pants have become, the drop off in sales has been fairly significant as people are working from home and no longer need to tailor themselves to all those requirements. So it's been amazing to see the ebbs and flows, and we're not just talking about negatives, we're talking about positives as well. This report just came out yesterday about the ridiculous surge in industrial output in the US that hasn't happened since 1959. So it's been all over the place in terms of disruptions. And what has this meant from a supply chain perspective? Well, you have a situation where your demand might have increased, such as in face masks or hand sanitizers, or you may have seen dramatic decreases in things like cars or cameras. Or at the other end, your suppliers, as you looked at your supply network, are the suppliers available to you? Are they on allocation? Are you competing with somebody that in an industry you didn't even consider because of product availability? Have you lost a node or a leg in your supply chain network and can no longer get product from that part of the world because of something that's happened with the pandemic? Inventory, we've seen inventory overstocked, understocked, but really it's been, is it in the correct supply chain? Because our retail supply chain and the commercial supply chains saw a shift in demand. Product transitions, as you think about companies that have pivoted to pick up to start producing things like ventilators, where they might have previously producing some other high-tech equipment, and then ultimately being more deliberate in your risk review. what products do you need to shut down? I can remember hearing a talk within the last, I don't know, 2 months, and it was about bread and bread in the grocery stores. And the company said, you know, we had to make some tough decisions, and we decided to stop making raisin bread because the switchover from regular bread to raisin bread took too much time, too much allergen to clean up, and we just didn't have the people available or the resources available. So we've limited our SKU count, and that's allowed us to keep up demand with our primary items. So it's definitely been challenging times. And so the question is, what is it that we need to do about this? And what are our options? And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Polly to start the conversation.
Thank you, Anne. So the point is, as Anne said, disruptions are not new to supply chains, but the scope and scale of the disruptions are significant. And so volatility, uncertainty, things that we're used to dealing with from an analytics perspective, but need new approaches, they're here to stay. So we have to try a different approach to try to tackle these kinds of problems. So we're positing that there are 3 things that are keys to supply chain. First, analytics, of course. This is Worms with our heritage and Informs. We're advocates of analytics. But analytics isn't the only path to success. A key part of supply chain success is network and collaboration, as well as resiliency and agility. So we're going to talk about all 3 areas. So first, from an analytics perspective, the challenge we have is that right now, the past no longer predicts the future. And so we have to try new approaches to analytics in order to try to figure out how to see our way through these challenging times. I don't have to tell anyone that machine learning is a big focus these days. You can certainly point to this Gartner report to learn more, but the particular thing I want to point out that I think we'll see a shift on is that even as recently as a few weeks ago, Gartner was predicting that 3/4 of organizations are actually now going to move from just playing around with AI and machine learning to actually putting it into operations. So that's why I'm going to talk heavily today about machine learning. In the supply chain world, we certainly think at 3 different levels. We think at the strategic, tactical, and operational level. I'm an avid world traveler, and I hope one day to be traveling again. So if we think strategic level, it might be, where am I going to go on a trip? What part of the world might I go on? I'm thinking back to a backpacking trip I had through Asia as a college student. So let's look at all the places in the world I could go. At the strategic level, where should I go? At the tactical level, with my friend I travel with, we came up with an itinerary. Where do we think we should go? Let's plan that in advance for our 2.5 months on the road. And then at the operational level, we actually made some last minute changes as we went. So that's what it gets when you're on the ground. How do you make the changes? If we overlay the kinds of things we have to think about in supply chain with analytics, these are things, they're levels of analytics that probably most of us are familiar with. Descriptive analytics help us understand either what's happening now or what has recently happened. Predictive analytics is helping us look forward. What do we think is going to happen? And then prescriptive analytics, of course, is given what we know, what do we think is the best that we could do? And then if we apply these kinds of techniques to the world of supply chain, you can see that we're looking at things like at the strategic level, how might we apply optimization to look at supply chain design or routing questions? At the tactical level, what's our demand forecast going to be? How do we plan for capacity? At the operational level, where do we execute? Where can we replenish? I'll actually talk more about replenishment in a minute. So let's start with an example. A lot of machine learning examples we read about in supply chain start with demand, but we actually started with supply. And that's because one of our tenets as a company is that we start with customer problems. And so customers came to us with a supply problem. So I'm going to give you a simple example as a way to illustrate a way to think about machine learning on the supply side. Imagine a car. This one is cute, but is actually very simple because cars can actually have more than 30,000 parts. And each of those parts, of course, has to come from a supplier. And then each part from the supplier has a lead time. So the question is, from an analytics perspective, how can you predict when production can begin? Because as we've heard famously in the last several months, if you're missing even one bolt from a car, you can't build it. So just at the simplest level, I think of machine learning as often a marriage of both the analytics, in this case, a prediction, as well as the automation. So what machine learning can do for a problem like that lead times in a car is say, okay, let's analyze for those 30,000 lead times. as you can imagine, your average planner can't stay on top of what those 30,000 lead times are going to be and have an accurate understanding of them. With machine learning, we can analyze our historical patterns, and instead of just guessing that maybe this bolt and this screw that come from the same supplier are going to have the same lead time, even though that might not be the case, machine learning can actually look at the historical data, give us a prediction of what we think what the model thinks the lead time will be, and then we can set tolerances, set parameters basically to automate that. And then if the change from what we had been planning on based on the predicted model is minor, we can just heal the supply chain. We can make that change automatically, because part of the point of machine learning is to automate the mundane so that the planner can focus on the exceptions. And the exceptions are when we really want the model to alert us to the fact that, hey, your lead time for this particular part is really way off what it's historically been. It's outside of your parameters that you're comfortable with. You should do something about that. And that allows the planner to be an exception manager. And then, of course, this kind of application can help us monitor performance over time, maybe flag certain suppliers where we're having issues, and help us get a better management of our supply side issues. Same kind of thinking can be applied to yields for our supply chain. If you think about a major global chemical manufacturer, this is a test case we did with them, 20,000 items, they're certainly not going to have an accurate understanding of the yield for 20,000 items. Nobody can keep up with that. When we did the analysis, it turned out that in a quarter of the cases, their deviation was actually more than 5% what they thought it was going to be. So testing what the value would be of this kind of thinking, applying machine learning to the question of what's the yield going to be on our supply side, would have yielded 27 million euros in savings in late revenue and 11,000 in average inventory. So this is why we're going to see this move from piloting machine learning into moving into the operation. Now, demand is really what's gotten a lot of attention in recent times, because let me tell you, when we talk to analysts, when we talk to customers, when we talk to the market, what we hear from everyone right now is that one of the biggest problems in supply chains is that nobody understands demand and what to do about it, because it's very erratic right now. Even before today's unusual times, we've had a question of how can we improve the accuracy of our demand forecasts. Demand sensing is a technique where we can take machine learning and take our historical statistical forecast, which gives us a prediction, and then say, let's look vertically, let's look at other signals we might consider to improve the accuracy of that forecast. Maybe it's promotions that we've used, maybe it's weather, maybe it's social media. And then we layer that on top of our statistical forecast, and we can see whether or not, and the not is key because it may not add value, but see whether or not it adds value. So I mentioned social media as one example. Consider a large global tofu manufacturer, and maybe they have 55 different kinds of tofu they want to replenish across 140 stores. Hard to know how to do that, especially down to that level of granularity. And then I mentioned social media as a signal. Imagine if a celebrity chef tweets something about some dish they made with some kind of tofu. You can imagine that might cause spikes in demand, but maybe it's not for all their products, and maybe it's not at all their stores. So this is where something like demand sensing can really help. In this test case, the company experienced 60% fewer stockouts from increasing the accuracy using these external kinds of signals, but they didn't have to increase inventory to reduce stockouts. They actually were able to save inventory. So again, this is the kind of thing that gets people's attention. So the challenge with machine learning is, as we all know, machine learning learns from data. So how do you learn from data when right now our demand patterns are really erratic and unstable? The first thing I want to say is in what we're finding, this is an example of a best practice that we're doing with a retailer right now. So in the first stage, you can see our demand patterns are very erratic. We can't figure out what's going on. So all we can do is we have to override. This is where the value of the machine, the human, is putting the human at the center, their domain expertise. You want the human at the wheel so they can figure out, okay, how much toilet paper, how much perfume, and how much chocolate do I stock? I'm just gonna have to go with my intuition, because the previous months as well as the previous year's data is really not gonna help me right now make a good decision. So I'm just gonna have to go by the seat of my pants and make the best decision I can. Where we are now is that things we're kind of in this transition phase where we're not where we all expect we will be. Not that we know what that'll look like, but we're not there yet. but we're not quite in that immediacy phase. And so what we've been doing is saying, okay, let's categorize the demand patterns for the various segments that we have. And so there might be certain things like milk and eggs, highly perishable. You can't pantry stock on milk and eggs. So the demand has been really pretty stable, versus other things that it might be like luxury goods where they've fallen off and they really stayed falling off, versus something like perfume or cosmetics where they dropped off right away, but they're picking back up again. And so what we've been able to do is segment the kinds of demand patterns and then essentially use a heuristic to apply the change that we're seeing, that pattern, moving forward in a prediction. But then, as I mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that the prior year's patterns, the current patterns, what we saw in March 2020, doesn't affect the way we're trying to do our models moving forward. So we're having to use new techniques to try to make sure that we can, how do we build machine learning models in the future? So we're doing things like using sensoring in order to pull out the outliers, maybe change point detection in order to try to find the inflection points in the change data, and then treat our forecasting differently at both ends of the inflection points, and use these kinds of techniques in order to ensure that our machine learning models moving forward can use as much intelligence as possible in spite of the erratic behavior we're experiencing. A lot of these techniques are new. In fact, this is a brave new world we're all in, but even before that, I can still tell you that as much as we in the Informs and the Worms community love analytics, many customers that we talk to, and in general, I'm sure all of you all talk to at your own companies, we know that analytics is still new for many folks. The new kinds of techniques we're talking about call for new principles, and I'm going to talk about all three of them briefly here. Particularly related to machine learning. So the first I'm going to mention is the importance of interpretability. So I'm not going to walk into this, but I will give a shout out here to Lloyd Shapley, who is an Informs member, was an Informs member and an Informs fellow, in fact. And he came up with the notion of a SHAP diagram. And the point is to say that we want to, your average supply chain planner does not know how to write code in Python, and they may not know how to interpret any code or results, but we need to give them tools so they can look at, if I decide to look at the value of a promotion or holidays or the day of the week, how can I know whether or not that signal made an impact on my forecast? And tools like this that give interpretability to the planner are critical to ensuring their adoption. Second is applicability. So first principle is interpretability, second is applicability. I've also been very involved in certification with analytics, the Certified Analytics Professional Program, and I'm proud to say that the first step in the analytics lifecycle that we always talk about is you must start with business problem framing. So I'm sure many of you all are familiar with the kind of buzzword bingo that goes on in the world, and those of you in organizations, I'm thinking of a OR guy I hired at my last job who in his previous job had his boss come to him and say, "Can't you just do some of that machine learning?" And so, no, we can't just do some of that machine learning, nor should we. We should always start with the business problem and then choose the right tool for the right problem at the right time. And I emphasize all three elements because it may be the right tool for the right problem, but not the right time. And finally, we should always consider Occam's razor. We never want to have a more advanced tool than we need for the problem at hand. Recurrent neural networks can be great, but not if logistic regression will do the problem, solve the problem just as well. And finally, the third point is accessibility. And in this case, I mean not accessibility in terms of ensuring people with all abilities can participate, but accessibility meaning as we democratize analytics and more people participate, the use of analytics and the consumption of analytics will go far beyond the walls of Informs. So we need to make sure that people have access to it. And so what I'm showing you here is the part on the left is where your average planner, all they need to do is be able to name a signal. I want to look at weather, what impact that might have on my demand forecast. Input the data, and then all those things that our kinds of folks know how to do, clean and prepare the data, do tuning of hyperparameters, validate the model, et cetera. They don't have to know any of that. That's all sort of behind a wall, and they just get results that they need to deal with. So using approaches like automated machine learning, which is what I'm talking about here, or AutoML, are really critical to making sure that the analytics is available to everyone and not just those of us who have the keys to the kingdom.
Oh, I have to take myself out mute to continue. So it's great that we have all of these techniques in hand, and many of us are well versed in different pieces of them. But I wanted to take a moment and sort of talk about a little tongue-in-cheek about isolation. We've all been going through a series of isolated activities over the last months, and it's lonely. And while for us personally in our homes, you know, maybe being our unwanted coworkers making sudden appearances at times, it's sort of become a little bit of our norm. And we as humans in our daily lives, it's not an ideal setting, but we figured out, and likely if you made a wrong decision and picked up ordered the wrong type of toothpaste, it's not really the end of the world. But when you talk about supply chains in the context of isolation, it can be really challenging and really damaging, in fact. And this siloed type of approach to supply chain is quite prevalent even before we got into the situation we are in right now, but almost exacerbated by the disruptions that we've been experiencing. So when you have a supply chain that is functionally focused, really looking at localized modeling, localized analysis with latency between the different stages, and quite frankly, back into your finance organization, your marketing organization, or forward to your distribution network. Though that latency, the challenges in localized modeling, localized decision-making really can result in all kinds of challenges. Different views of the truth at different stages because you're waiting for information to be passed. You see a lot of sequential processing, the inability to actually run in parallel. And all of this, and this community certainly knows about what happens when you wind up in a localized optima, suboptimal outcomes versus focusing on something more globally. And for those of you who haven't heard a podcast or cross paths with Nada Sanders, I would highly suggest that you do. But she speaks about sophisticated models, especially AI ML models. You can have one function that might be really, really solid in their modeling capabilities, really solid in their techniques. But if they're not able, that input or output is not able to be consumed by the next stage, the next node, the next phase in your business, then all you're left with are silos, highly efficient silos, but you're still missing this overarching approach. So we want to talk a moment about how do you break down those silos to enable collaboration? Because right now, this is more critical than ever. So the first piece is around visibility. And we need a capability to start removing some of this fog. Because the same way we say, I know there's a sort of classical analogy that as we, reduce the water in the river, the rocks start to appear. What I would say, each one of these disruptions has changed those tiny rocks into massive boulders that are just on the cusp of damaging some part of your supply chain. So what do you need to do? Let's ensure that we figured out how to focus on data and get an ability to see that data in different parts of the organization, that there is a common language in describing your data elements. And as a decision is being made that's going to impact one of those elements, that it's transparent across the organization. Now, this is not something that just is going to happen with, with the decision to do it, right? There is a cultural element and awareness that there needs to be philosophies and humans in the process who have opened their mind to this notion of sharing for success. And part of that comes from a network alignment, right? Making sure that you have a common set of measures that are agreed upon by all elements across the supply chain. You're all working towards a common goal. That we look at aligning the workflows as part of that. And as you go through and understand what do those workflows look like, what does that network look like, what is your full supply chain map? Because I will tell you right now that through COVID and as people are looking at different types of onshoring opportunities, dual sourcing opportunities, looking at making sure that your not only your finished product, but that your subcomponents are close to your customer, as close to your customer as possible, is creating an increasingly complex supply chain architecture. So the importance of understanding that network, having that network aligned, having visibility to it, and being able to understand that when one part of demand moves on this side, that you're able to immediately see what the impact is to supply on the other side. If you suddenly have to make a decision that swaps between one manufacturing facility to the other, what does that mean? What does that mean to the full amount of demand that you are responding to as a supply chain? We recently spoke to a customer in life sciences, and he spoke about this at length, about how the redesign of his supply chain, and he did mention that it needed to get to a certain level of maturity before he could even start thinking about the system side of it. But having gone through this journey, that having that network design and that visibility, that they were able to almost instantly understand where they were being impacted as a result of COVID-19 challenges, immediately take the action to shift their manufacturing to another plant, and without any challenges to fulfilling their demand, despite the fact that their demand profile had gone completely erratic, as Polly had mentioned earlier. Now, all of this needs to be supported by digitalization. Before all of this has started, supply chains were in the hot seat for digitalization. We were seeing that oftentimes, because of the cross-functional nature of supply chain, that digitalization efforts were being driven by the chief supply chain officer. But this has been accelerated. The urgency of automation, the urgency of social distancing, of starting my plant with as much robotics and automation as possible, has really accelerated as a result of the pandemic. So even legislations around things like 5G have been accelerated to be able to get to greater use of these technologies sooner. And some of them have required a fundamental shift in the way we look at our supply chain. We'll talk about this a little bit more later, but this network approach, so being able to visualize all of your data across the end-to-end supply chain, complement that with a well-described network, and then enrich it with digital technologies, really speaks to what we're going to see emerge and what the techniques are to be able to mitigate disruptions. Of course, if you don't have the right mindset, culturally you're not prepared, or you don't have the talent that understands the full depth of that, you're not going to get there. So all of this needs to be complemented with the people, of course. But none of this, if you're not able to manage resiliency and operate with a level of agility, none of this matters. So I'm going to hand it over to Polly, who's going to take you through that part of the conversation.
So one thing about me is I live in the West, where it's horse country. So this is certainly a great image, because horses are strong and certainly a model of fast. And as Ann said, we think that in a supply chain, in this time in general, but now we've seen it more than ever. In fact, I'm thinking about a line from one of our customers who said, you know, a supply chain can really be fairly simple and work reasonably well until there's a disruption. So the disruption is when you really see the importance of things like resiliency and agility. Not that they weren't always important, but that's when they really show their colors. So just to sort of say what we mean when we're talking about these things, resiliency, by resiliency, what I mean is thinking about literally how do you bounce back. So when a disruption comes along, how can you bounce back and ideally continue to function? And not only continue to function, but ideally meet all your demands on time in spite of the disruption. That's resiliency. Agility is about saying, okay, how can I operate at the speed of business? And we say at the speed of business because what that speed or what that time horizon is really may vary in your business. Pharmaceutical companies may plan for drugs years out, whereas a retail or a CPG supply chain maybe replanning in a matter of hours. But whatever the speed is of your business, you need to have the agility to be able to operate at that speed and that cadence. So to focus on resiliency for a minute, resiliency is really, in a sense, it's a form of insurance. And so risk management, as Ann mentioned earlier, is certainly a topic that's getting a lot of attention these days. And if you put in proper resiliency practices in particular, you will be in a better position to be able to handle a disruption when it comes along. And that's the point of this article here, which we would commend to you all. It's a great article. You want to anticipate as much as you can, but be prepared to react. And both are important capabilities to have in your supply chain. So you have to build in that resiliency in advance. Strategic planning is certainly one level of your supply chain in terms of network design, routing, all these kinds of things, where resiliency can be particularly important and a great place to build it in. Many of you may be familiar with the work of David and Edith Simchi-Levy. It's certainly gotten a lot of attention in recent times, and it's very timely work. And as Anne mentioned, in terms of the importance of networking, we've seen that it's not just a matter of knowing how your supplier is doing, but your supplier's supplier and on down in terms of the sub-tiers all the way down to the original source, because you need to be able to understand how they're doing, where the vulnerabilities are, what you can do about it. But a way to think about resiliency is also to think, okay, let's not just wait until it happens when we're in the moment and there's a problem and what can we do about it, but let's stress test it in advance. And so what their work talks about is the fact that you can model in advance. You can look at the measures of time to recovery. If there was a problem with a given node, how long would it take to recover? And time to survive, how long could you survive without that known in advance? You can actually model this and quantify it, and then with that in advance, you can stress test your supply chains and see where you're strong or strong enough and where you're weakest. That's the kind of resiliency we're talking about. That's one example of work. Warren Powell from Princeton is doing some interesting work these days, and we're looking at that along with other people in this field. But one of the things he's thinking about is sequential optimization under uncertainty, and how do we use newer or evolving methods like reinforcement learning married with stochastic optimization to try to figure out, given all the uncertainty we have, how can we make better decisions in it? Now, what we know, and the Dutch may be the masters at teaching us this, is that we're going to build in as much resiliency as we can. We're going to build those dikes. In fact, some of you may remember the Edelman competition from several years ago with the Dutch and their flood planning as a winner. And I thought about that when I was thinking about this, because what the Dutch know is that no matter how much resiliency we try to build in, disruption is unavoidable. There are going to be times when the dams are going to break. And so what we want to do is be prepared as much as we can. When a disruption happens, it narrows the gap between your strategic planning and your operational execution. You have to be able to move much more quickly. So some of you may be familiar with the notion of Agile. It has many meanings. In this case, what I mean is Agile software development. And if you've ever been exposed to Agile software development, you know that the proposal is that instead of working backwards from, I'm going to build a car, I'm going to start with putting the wheels on my chassis. Instead, we're going to think about a minimum viable product. We're going to say, okay, if I need to do transportation, what's the simplest thing I can build and get it out there quickly? Let's get a skateboard out there so I can move quickly. Well, I liken that to planning in the supply chain world, because yes, there's your network design. You want to think about what's the ideal design for your supply chain. But when you're having to make decisions on the fly, you have to rapidly move back and forth between planning and execution, iterate, change, adjust. And so that's where you want to make good decisions as best as you can. So as an example, this is just an illustration here. Imagine that you have, if we start at the bottom left, imagine that you have one of your contract manufacturers. There's a lower level component part that's going to be delayed. There's a problem with that part. What you can see from these red circles across the supply chain is that that one part propagates up through the supply chain based on the dependencies. So what starts out as just a low-level component delay at a subcontract supplier moves up through the sub-assembly to the final assembly, and all of a sudden you've got a customer problem because of this one part missing. So what are you going to do about this? How are you going to make a better decision in the moment? And again, at the speed of your business, particularly when you're in CPG, and Anne will talk about an example of this in a minute, you're having to make those rapid, quick, iterative decisions, because the ongoing volatility we face means that dynamic replanning is essential. So you want to look at that across your entire network, and ideally have it connected. You don't want those highly efficient silos, as Anne mentioned earlier. You want to have the parts of your supply chain connected so that you can make a decision and make a better decision by looking at the impact of what am I going to do about this part delay from my contract manufacturer. And if I'm looking at alternatives, what's the impact not only on cost, which might matter to me if I'm in supply, but on customer delivery, all the way on up to the end of my supply chain. I want to make the best decision, look at the impact across my entire supply chain. Some ways you can do that are to model scenarios in advance. Practice makes perfect, right? So if you practice more, you're going to be more agile. And what I mean by that is, in fact, one of the customers that we work with has literally a playbook of 1,200 scenarios. They have made scenarios in advance for all kinds of situations they might face. They've modeled them to try to figure out how can they be prepared. And then when the disruption happens, they have a whole playbook they can turn to of what their alternatives are. You may not be able to make that kind of advanced planning, but if you can look at what's happening, I can see maybe another customer told us that they could see that they were facing inventory risks at certain points in their supply chain, and they can see that they were going to have supplier disruptions. If you can see that coming as you go because your supply chain is connected, you can make quick, directionally accurate decisions to try to forestall problems before they happen and address where you're going to allocate volume. You can also try methods, and this is another best practice we heard. Where can you apply delayed differentiation in order to preserve the optionality? You want to have as many options as possible and make the last minute decision as best you can in order to give your supply chain the agility you need to be successful. But we have to move from practicing to putting it into action.
Well, we're getting close to the end here, so hopefully we're getting a few questions teed up. But I wanted to at least walk you through a few examples of companies that were met with great disruption and through agility were able to come out either unscathed or with minimal impact. Keysight Technologies makes equipment for testing, so testing electronics equipment. They're located in Northern California, I think in and around the Santa Rosa area. And in October 2017, those of you who are in the California area will undoubtedly remember the Tubbs fire. It had a pretty detrimental impact on the Sonoma Valley, which is one of my favorite vacation spots. Nonetheless, through this time, houses were damaged. Every single one of their buildings either experienced fire damage or water damage, and they had several displaced employees. But because they had modeled their supply chain in such a dynamic, agile fashion with this focus on the ability to see all of their supply chain, they had the concurrent planning approach to solving problems. They were able to not only ensure that none of their orders were canceled, they were able to meet all the demand, but for the following 2 quarters had higher than expected revenue. So they actually, the tweaks that they made to navigate through the fire actually resulted in an uptick for them. So it's a story that we as a company were very pleased and proud to be a part of, as they told. Merck, I don't have the exact date of this one when this happened, but Merck was hit with a pretty significant cyber attack. All of their systems froze, but their supply chain had been designed, again, to have immediate access to information, the transparency to share. They were able to understand the impact of changes in demand on supply. Now, they did have a situation with their ERP. They weren't able to refresh their data because of this attack, but with the data that they had available to them and with all the information that they were able to keep available, they kept their supply chain running despite this terrible cyber attack. And then the last one I have here was around P&G, and there's a great video on our company website where the folks who are actually involved with this speak pretty dynamically about the event. And Hurricane Irma was also in 2017. That seemed to be a year with a lot of natural disasters. Hurricane Irma through the Midwest had great impacts, and P&G, as you know, based in Cincinnati, had they had impacts on their plants. They had to make some pretty critical decisions, and when they speak about it, they call their supply planner this kid. The kid came back with scenarios for us, and when they were short on inventory for some of their products, they actually reverted back to older models or older form factors of bottles and such to be able to meet the demand. And while their competitors had reportable, measurable impact on their quarterly earnings, P&G went through unscathed. They were offline for a couple of days, but they were unscathed ultimately in being able to meet their customer demands. So 3 great examples of where supply chains who had designed in agility, who had practiced, who had the opportunity to be risk resilient, were able to manage their way through disruption. But there's one big piece to realize through all of this. And I love Bill Frank's quote. I know he was one of the keynote speakers at the business analytics meeting earlier this year, but he speaks about the fact that, you know, AI can be fooled and analytics can be fooled. This picture is the one he speaks to all the time, where you can't actually tell if this woman is about to hit the ball or has just hit the ball. And it's a simple example, but it's about lacking context. And it's on us humans to put that expert judgment, the ingenuity, the conscience back into the modeling. Because at the end of the day, we all need to recognize machines are not accountable, the humans are. And so we always look to the supply chain with all of the pieces we spoke about putting the human in the center of it. So given that, and one of the big trends Polly and I have been noticing is that there really is a change in what that supply chain professional looks like. And this is great news for our community. We mirror off of the citizen data scientist that Gartner has been proposing, and we're actually saying it's the supply chain citizen data scientist. So those of you coming out of Masters in Analytics programs who might have some domain expertise and understand a math of supply chain. I'm not saying you're building the math, but you understand the math of the supply chain. But marry that along with softer skills around communication, influence, and change management, as well as understanding the commerce of the business that you're in. That combination is really who the future supply chain practitioner, supply chain professional will be. So we're suggesting it's a fantastic career path in very high demand right now. So if you're considering, I did see lots of student names across that registration list. So if you're interested in talking more about that or like to share your thoughts or questions, certainly this is one area where we would highly suggest you consider taking your educational path. So that brings us to an end of what we were hoping to share today. Wanted to recognize that there really has been a seismic shift in the analytics tools used to bring the supply chain to life, particularly in the AI machine learning space. These new techniques, though, do require us to think a little differently. We want to make sure that we're thinking in terms of interpretability and accessibility of the information. The technologies that complement that bring the data to the surface for us to be able to run those models, there are many new ones out there, and they're definitely worth considering, but do not do it in isolation. Think about the workflow of the human. Do not do a lift and shift of where we were with a new technology and hope that it's going to get better, because it won't. You really need to think about it in complement of the entire process. Excuse me. And ultimately, if you haven't done your due diligence around preparing for the worst, even with the best plans, you're not going to make it through this. So it really is about plan for the best, but prepare for the worst. And a strong plan around resiliency and agility will get there. And it really does take the human at the center to make this all come together. So with that, I'm going to say on behalf of Polly and myself, thank you so much. And hopefully we can open it up for some questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Anne and Polly. We'll go ahead now and take some time for questions. Just a reminder, please type your questions in a Q&A box of a control panel rather than in a chat. We get a couple in the chat, and it's easier to manage. Okay, one particular question here we have. Can you please touch upon algorithmic bias in machine learning models? For example, how do we make sure that all the inputs are really valid for short-term forecast?
A great question. Anne, you want to take that? You want me to take that?
You go ahead.
All right. So algorithmic bias is certainly a very important consideration. I'm glad you brought that up. And there's all kinds of forms of algorithmic bias. Certainly one of them is around whether or not we have a diverse enough set of inputs, meaning a diverse enough set of people looking at the data that's going in. Data is only as good as, or our models are only as good as the data that goes in. So it's a fair question. I'd say one of my top tip for algorithmic bias is looking at two things. One is making sure you have a diverse and inclusive group of people participating in the process, both looking at the data, building the models, and then looking at the results, because you have to sort of do that intuition check on the results. Do they make sense for you? And you want to have who you is be a diverse group of people. And then the second thing about that is that context matters. And so we think the math is great and the math is great, but we need to marry the math with that human intuition, which may be able to look at the results and say, hold on a second here, that there's something about this that just doesn't make sense to me. I don't care if the math says that's the right result, it doesn't make sense to me. So you have to not be afraid to step beyond the math and look at the human context that you can provide to decide whether or not it makes sense. And then of course, there's a whole host of more technical approaches to addressing algorithmic bias, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Another question is from slide 41. How could we quantify resilience in strategic formulations?
Yeah, I saw that question there. I think probably that's a better one to follow up on, but I think that was a student at Clemson, so I appreciate your question there. There's a lot of different models, but one that I really liked is from Jeff Kim, who's over at Wake Forest, and he essentially says, as you design your optimization model and you get that answer, constrain that answer out of being a possibility and see what else comes out. First of all, he says you spend a lot of time building that model, so you get as much out of it as you possibly can, but by constraining that optimal solution, you might find a parallel optimal, you may find second best, but it's a lot more feasible for the business problem you're trying to solve. And by creating a space that allows you then to gives you some options, and then that can help you then go and build that resiliency playbook that Polly spoke about. There are many different ways, and whoever asked that question, if you wanted to drop us an email or follow up with us on LinkedIn afterwards, we'd be happy to get you some more examples.
But one other specific answer I'll give to that is if you look up the Simchi-Levy papers, you'll see they do have a quantified approach to how to, their particular approach to addressing resiliency using a modeling approach. So I would encourage you to look up their work.
It's true.
Another question, Irving, last thing is asking, given that the forecasting models were disrupted as COVID-19 hit, did business people who depended on those models lose faith in the analytics because the predictions were so poor? It took some time for the predictions to be better.
Leave it to Irv to throw the tough question out there. You know, I do think there certainly was some seat of the pants types of execution of models. But as far as lose faith, I think, you know, what we've seen is that people are interested even more than ever in how the analytics that drive our models are going to help them describe their business. So I haven't personally had somebody sort of lose faith in the analytics necessarily, but I can see how at least being in a challenging moment might lead you to make decisions on the fly in the absence of analytics. Polly, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. One, I'll say I agree. I have not heard anything about this. I think some of it is that in the moment when people are having to just do the best they can, nobody expects analytics to have some magical results. So I don't think that it's caused them to lose any faith. And from some of the data I've seen, in fact, that's why I pulled up that Gartner study that was from late June. It was saying that the value and interest in advanced analytics, including machine learning, is higher than ever. So I think that's another indicator that people have not lost faith. They just expect it can answer different questions.
Another question, I think this is some sort of a continuation of what we discussed now. Is there one business problem you are hearing the most from your clients during COVID-19? Perhaps demand forecasting, supply side disruptions, operational challenges, other?
I don't know that I have one in particular, but certainly the supply side disruptions, you know, if you look at who our customers are, that would make sense. But the supply side disruptions, then what to do about it. And then this piece that I mentioned earlier about switching technologies as companies have gone from maybe shifting to do more manufacturing of PPE in some way, shape, or form. I think those have been the challenges that have emerged. Because we're such a strong believer of scenario planning and being able to understand in that instant the implications on your supply chain, it's really been about sitting at the center of all of those disruptions and understanding very quickly if you need to make an adjustment to your demand profile, what are the implications, how does that change your supply profile, can you then change that again to be able to see a better supply chain performance holistically. And we've been told more than once that we are hypothetically, but our technology is sitting at the center of these war rooms as people figure out how to navigate the challenges of COVID-19.
We're now at the top of our hour, but we can probably take one more question here. Can you speak more about the importance of concurrent planning?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want me to do that, or Polly, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So concurrent planning, the reason why we think it's so important is that when you talk about a supply chain, a node in your supply chain goes out and you're trying to figure out what's the alternate on the supply side in terms of an alternate supplier. If you've got a materials resource plan that takes you 24 hours to run, you're not going to be very agile in terms of the quickness of your response and your ability to try to figure out what do I do now that there's a problem there. So concurrent planning is that ability to say, okay, I can get the answer to what's going to be the impact across my entire supply chain with a change in a certain material instantly, and then look at that impact using criteria I've set in terms of what matters most to me. Is it lead time? Is it, and having weights, is it cost? Is it customer satisfaction? Whatever it is. So it's weighing that instant response with a view across the entire supply chain, give you real-time information and visibility across the supply chain. So it's not just me making the best decision, but it's me in agreement with my peers that I can collaborate with that we're looking at the same information.
Yeah, I think I know the author of that question, but it really is when your supply planners, your demand planners, your S&OP leads can all see together when a change has happened in one of those nodes, they're instantly able to understand the impact. And that's really one of the values, and that, that agility piece that Polly spoke to, by having everybody see that information and broken down those silos so that you're actually full on collaborating, you're able to all have better metrics at the end of the day. So it's how do you actually get better, drive a leaner, more efficient supply chain, tie that back to sustainability if that's one of the key metrics for your organization. It can really help deliver against all those different parameters.
And one last thing I'd like to say is that I see there's a question here about applying academic research in applied setting. I would certainly say that we do that, particularly on our analytics side, actually not just across our analytics organization and product, we regularly look at academic papers because we are strong believers in academic industry collaboration. In fact, one of the other responsibilities I own is running our academic program. So I will make a statement here that one of the things Ann and I are willing to offer, along with some colleagues that have helped us with this, is that given how many of you are probably academics out there, if you're teaching classes and you're needing to be online now because of the current situation, we made an offer through Informs Connect to give virtual lectures on the kinds of things we just talked about to universities, if that would be of helpful and interest to your classes. I think we've spoken to more than 600 students now in more than a dozen classes. So reach out to either of us if that's of interest to you, and we'd be happy to help, because again, we are big believers in that academic industry collaboration, both on the teaching side as well as the research side.
Okay. I think we covered all the questions in the mailbox. Well, thank you, Ann and Polly. Is there anything else you want to just say before we wrap up?
No, well, thank you for the opportunity. This was great.
Yeah, it's fun.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate being here. Ann and Polly, thanks for sharing your insights and expertise. Thanks for time, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.